Thank you all so much for joining us for the first seminar in our four-part series. We hope that the information that we're providing to people in Louisiana and those of you joining us from elsewhere will deepen your understanding of the policy and legal environment that has shaped access to abortion. My name is Michelle Ehrenberg. I'm the co-founder and executive director of LIFT Louisiana. We are an organization that educates, advocates, and litigates for policy changes that will improve the health and well-being of Louisiana's women, their families, and their communities. We have a lot to cover today, but first, a few things. To minimize background noise, we have muted all participants and are not using video. If you have a question, please enter it in the chat, and my colleague Robin will ask it when we get to the Q&A. We have a quick poll to get your feedback at the end, so I hope you'll take a minute to respond when we launch it. And finally, we are recording this seminar and we'll post it on our YouTube channel tomorrow. Our focus today is on the history of how abortion has been regulated and legislated in Louisiana. Knowing this history is important to our understanding of how the anti-abortion agenda and tactics have evolved and how the movement to protect abortion rights has responded. This is, in a sense, a lesson in how we got here and why we must continue to be engaged in protecting reproductive freedom, especially as we are confronting a constitutional amendment on the ballot this November that would strip people of the right to abortion and prohibit any public funding of abortion. Between 2011 and 2017, the abortion rate in Louisiana fell by 19%. Abortion restrictions were not the main driver of the decline, but these restrictions, particularly those imposing unnecessary, intentionally burdensome regulation on providers, have played a role in shutting down abortion clinics and thereby reducing access to abortion. Louisiana has enacted 89 abortion restrictions since 1973, the most of any state. Any one of these restrictions can make abortion inaccessible for many people, especially those who have low incomes or face other barriers to health care. Not every restriction enacted in Louisiana or other states is in effect. Some have been struck down in court. Our upcoming seminar on September 23rd will go into much more detail about legal challenges to these restrictions, and we'll also provide more details about the impacts of restrictions on how clinics operate and how patients access abortion during the seminar on September 30th. So please join us for those. So as far back as the 19th century, states began enacting bans on abortion. And at the time, these bans were about protecting the life of the pregnant person, given the number of deaths caused by abortions. However, most states had exceptions for the life or health of the pregnant person. Louisiana was the only state to not have a therapeutic exception in their legislative bans on abortion. In the 1960s, Louisiana had two statutes, one in the criminal code that prohibited all abortions, and the Medical Practices Act, which allowed abortions to be performed by licensed physicians with consultation and approval by another physician. Birth control was also not legal in Louisiana until 1965. It's important to note that public opinion and the position of religious communities regarding abortion has changed over the decades. In 1968, the American Baptist Convention believed that abortion decisions should be left to the pregnant person in the first trimester. In 1970, the Louisiana Clergy Consultation Service began referring people for abortion to states where it was legal. This group of ministers of many faiths included Methodists and Baptists who believed that the state's abortion laws were immoral and that abortion should be decriminalized. In 1972, 53% of Southerners agreed that the decision to have an abortion should be made by a woman and her physician. In a 1975 statewide poll, 42% of Louisiana voters strongly favored upholding a woman's right to have an abortion. By 1981, however, public opinion in Louisiana had veered from the national pro-choice consensus when a newspaper survey revealed that 54% of Louisiana voters favored an abortion ban. Polling conducted in 2020 showed that only 35% of people in Louisiana believe that abortion should be legal in most cases, and 42% believe that it should only be allowed in limited cases. Louisiana's shift to an anti-abortion majority coincided with the onset of the so-called culture wars and the rise of the Christian right, a loose alliance between conservative evangelicals and Catholics that initially coalesced to oppose the IRS's revoking the tax-exempt status of racially discriminatory private schools in 1978. The religious makeup of Louisiana's population provided the Christian right with the ideal demographic for waging a battle against abortion. In their relentless attempts to prevent abortions, either through direct action tactics or legislation, anti-abortion activists and legislators have turned the state of Louisiana into an important bellwether state for anti-abortion activity. There were three phases of Louisiana's abortion wars that correspond to the shifting tactics of the anti-abortion movement, and with each shift reflects a change in the legal environment at the national level. The first phase in the abortion wars from 1973 to the early 1980s focused on the legislative arena, with anti-abortion state legislators reacting to the Roe decision. In January 1973, the Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in Roe v. Wade. By a 7-2 margin, the court determined that the right to privacy is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. The ruling prohibited the states from banning abortions in the first and second trimester, but it did allow states to impose some regulations on abortion after the first trimester. Despite the ruling in Roe a month earlier, Louisiana continued to enforce its restrictive criminal abortion law, which prohibited all abortions. So the ACLU filed a lawsuit in February of 1973, which resulted in Louisiana's criminal abortion statute finally being struck down. Within a year of the Roe decision, 6 abortion facilities opened in New Orleans. On July 3, 1974, Louisiana's first abortion clinic, the Delta Women's Clinic, opened on St. Charles Avenue as a full-service women's medical facility. It offered prenatal care, birth control, and abortions. The Louisiana Right to Life pressured the then Attorney General Gus to shut down the clinic by filing a lawsuit claiming the clinic was violating laws that were still on the books, like Louisiana's Medical Practice Act, which suspended or revoked the licenses of doctors who performed abortions. The case made its way to the Supreme Court, and on January 13, 1975, the court ruled the Medical Practices Act is unconstitutional. So abortion remained unregulated in the state until 1976, when conservative state legislators passed a bevy of anti-abortion bills. First, in 1976, State Senator Barham introduced a bill to amend the state's criminal code to redefine a person as a human being from the moment of fertilization and implantation. This law was struck down. The next year, in 1977, 3 more abortion clinics, including another Delta Women's Clinic, opened in Baton Rouge. That same year, a bill by Representative Carson aimed to regulate rather than ban abortions. This law demanded that doctors inform women who sought abortions that human life begins at the moment of conception. It also required parental consent for people younger than 18 and mandated the burial or cremation of any aborted fetal tissue. This last requirement would be pushed again by legislators 40 years later. Most of Carson's bill was struck down by a federal judge in 1980. But anti-abortion legislators brought back the parental consent portion of the bill, and in 1981, that was upheld. The second phase of the abortion wars occurred from the early 80s to 94 and involved fewer legislative efforts to restrict abortion. This period was marked by the anti-abortion movement's ineffective attempt to prevent abortion through the use of direct action, protest tactics, and violence aimed at clinics, doctors, and women seeking abortion. Anti-abortion legislators did have a victory in 1989 when the Supreme Court in Webster v. Reproductive Health Services upheld laws in Missouri that required doctors to conduct viability tests, on women beginning in the 20th week of pregnancy to determine the stage of development. Laws that prohibited the use of public employees and public facilities to perform or assist in abortions, and banned public employees and public facilities from encouraging or counseling pregnant women to have an abortion. I will note that 300,000 pro-choice activists attended a Lincoln Memorial rally to protest in advance of the Supreme Court's Webster decision. In June of 1991, Louisiana legislators approved the strongest anti-abortion piece of legislation in the country at the time, in the wake of the Webster decision. This bill banned all abortions except when a woman's life was at risk or when her pregnancy had resulted from rape or incest. Patients who had survived rape were required to notify the proper legal authorities within 7 days, according to the statute. Governor Buddy Roemer, who identified as pro-life, did veto the bill, but the legislature overrode his veto, marking the first time in Louisiana history that the legislature overrode a veto by any Louisiana governor. Later, a U.S. district judge ruled the law unconstitutional, and the case was appealed to the Fifth Circuit. Before they could render a ruling, though, the Supreme Court handed down its decision in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And again, we'll go into more detail on this case during the September 23rd seminar, but essentially the ruling upheld the essential holdings of Roe. However, it set out to allow for states to expand abortion restrictions so long as it did not have, quote, the purpose or effect of placing a substantial obstacle in the path of a woman seeking an abortion. Following the Casey ruling, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals struck down the Louisiana law in September of 1992. Between 1982 and 1992, the number of abortion clinics in the state decreased by 1, going from 18 to 17. Having failed to accomplish its objective of outlawing abortions through the legislative process, anti-abortion forces in Louisiana tried direct action tactics, such as mass protests and physically blocking clinic doors. But a segment of these activists resorted to terrorism, using violent and lethal tactics of bombing clinics and assassinating abortion doctors. On the 12th anniversary of Roe in 1985, the River City Women's Clinic in Baton Rouge received a bomb threat. Responding to the threat, now activists held a vigil and began to escort women seeking abortions into the clinic. Later that year, both the Delta Women's Clinic and the River City Women's Clinic in Baton Rouge were targets of arson attacks. In March of 1968, there was an arson attempt at the Acadian Women's Clinic in Baton Rouge. And in 1992, Operation Rescue brought thousands of demonstrators to Louisiana. Their demonstrations included blockades of clinic entrances and adjacent streets. While most of the violence occurred in the 80s and early 90s, these terrorist tactics and clinic harassment continued during the 90s, early 2000s, and even today. A few other examples. In 1998, the United States saw 6 arson attacks, 4 bombings, 1 murder, and 19 acid attacks on clinics across the country, including in Louisiana. In July of 2001, a fire destroyed the Delta Women's Clinic in Baton Rouge. And on December 12, 2005, Patricia Hughes and Jeremy Donahoe threw a Molotov cocktail at the clinic in Shreveport. The device missed the building and there was no severe damage caused. And finally, in 2019, State Senator John Milkovich invited a woman who had been convicted of arson at abortion clinics to testify in support of his effort to ban abortions in the state. So during the third phase, which begins in 1994 and brings us to the present, anti-abortion forces returned to the legislative and judicial realms. Responding to the Casey decision that allowed states to place additional restrictions on abortion, these activists focused on eroding the protections that Roe had initially guaranteed. This period also saw the federal government begin to curb direct action tactics and violence aimed at abortion clinics and clinic employees. In the period since the Casey decision, legislation in Louisiana has been introduced or enacted that restricts where abortion services may be provided, who may provide abortion services, different kinds of abortion bans, including things like gestational age bans, procedure bans, reason-based bans, bias counseling, mandatory delays, prohibitions on insurance coverage for abortion, banning abortion coverage for low-income people, requiring parental consent for people under 18, allowing medical providers to refuse to provide abortion care, and bans on counseling and referral for abortion. I think this slide gives you a pretty good indication of this period of time. How many anti-abortion laws or resolutions were introduced in the legislature and how that number has increased over time. In June of 1995, State Representative Sharon Weston, who's now the mayor of Baton Rouge, passed the state's waiting period law, which also required patients to receive information about the stages of fetal development and the physical and psychological risk associated with abortion. It also required patients be given information about alternatives to abortion, such as adoption. And this law was upheld by the courts, and it went into effect September 25th, 1995. 2 years later, Louisiana Senator Tommy Casanova introduced a ban on so-called partial birth abortions that lacked an exception for the health of the pregnant person. Louisiana's law was challenged, and on March 4th, 1999, a permanent injunction was issued that barred the state from enforcing the law. Failing to enact an abortion ban, anti-abortion legislators then turned to new and ultimately more effective tactics of regulating abortion clinics out of business through excessive health and medical regulations and burdensome licensing requirements. In 1999, Louisiana introduced the first law that mandated abortion clinics adhere to the same licensing requirements as ambulatory surgical centers. Because the state of Louisiana did not present ample medical evidence to support its claim that the law would improve the health of pregnant women, enforcement of the law was blocked by court on August 6, 1999. The second law gave state officials broader authority to inspect abortion clinics. Abortion opponents stated that the law would make abortion safer. This law also was challenged, and a settlement was reached that allowed state health officials to inspect abortion clinics, but only with permission from the clinic or through a judge's order. Since 2008, regulators with the Louisiana Department of Health have forced many clinics to close for trivial reasons such as paperwork inconsistencies. 10 years after Louisiana attempted to ban abortions later in pregnancy, in April of 2007, the Supreme Court's new anti-abortion majority upheld the federal ban on late-term abortions in Gonzalez v. Carhart. 3 months later, Louisiana legislators overwhelmingly approved one of the nation's most restrictive late-term bans, which the state modeled after the federal law. Louisiana became the first state to enact this type of ban when Governor Kathleen Blanco, an anti-abortion Catholic, signed the bill into law in July 2007. In the last 2 decades, conservative state legislators have passed a significant number of anti-abortion laws. And while none of these laws directly challenge Roe, each one has made obtaining an abortion increasingly difficult in Louisiana through enforcing excessive requirements for doctors who perform abortions and the people who receive them. Some of these laws have been challenged and overturned, but most of them are in effect today. So I will just note a few of them. a law called the Woman's Right to Know law, which requires bias counseling and misinformation or medically inaccurate information be provided to patients. Laws that allow providers to refuse to provide information or counseling or to provide abortions themselves based on religious objections. In 2009, the state passed a law that redirected the funding from the Choose Life license plates to go to the Louisiana Right to Life Education Committee, which has resulted in tens of thousands of dollars each year being funneled into that anti-abortion organization. In 2010, Louisiana passed an ultrasound requirement and a law that prohibited coverage of elective abortions by health insurance providers. In 2011, we saw efforts to regulate fetal tissue donation and to strip funding from Planned Parenthood. 2012, the ultrasound requirement was amended to also require that a heartbeat be made audible and that the ultrasound images be displayed. That year was also when Louisiana passed a ban on abortions after 20 weeks. In 2013, there were efforts to prohibit the construction and operation of a Planned Parenthood clinic. And in 2014, Louisiana's admitting privileges law was passed, as well as more legislation restricting public funds for abortion and requiring additional misinformation. In 2016, there were 12 bills or resolutions introduced related to abortion. Some of these included more efforts to defund Planned Parenthood, a ban on abortions based on a diagnosis of a genetic anomaly, a ban on a common second trimester procedure, expanding the waiting period for abortions from 24 hours to 72 hours, and more. In 2018, Louisiana passed a ban on abortions at after 15 weeks of pregnancy. That law is not in effect. And we also saw a lot of different bills that were related to fetal tissue donation, burial, and cremation requirements. In 2019, Louisiana passed a ban on abortions at as early as 6 weeks. This law is also not in effect. And also in 2019, Louisiana, the legislature referred a constitutional amendment, which will be on the ballot in November. We'll talk about that in a little bit more in a second. So during this period of burdensome clinic regulations and more laws restricting access to abortion, Louisiana saw the number of clinics between 2011 and 2017 reduced by 4. So we are now in a state with only 3 clinics. During this period, we've also seen abortion cases return to the Supreme Court. On June 27, 2016, the court issued their ruling in Whole Woman's Health, which struck down Texas's law known as HB2 that were designed to shut down clinics. This law included an admitting privileges requirement. The decision reaffirmed the constitutional right to access legal abortion. And then following this ruling, the Center for Reproductive Rights filed a lawsuit on behalf of Louisiana clinics and doctors to challenge the 7 anti-abortion bills that were passed in 2016. Again, this was the year that they passed restrictions like a mandatory 72-hour waiting period and a ban on second trimester procedures. So that lawsuit is still pending. And again, we'll discuss this in more detail on September 23rd. And then just this year, in the case of June Medical Services v. Russo from Louisiana, which challenged the Louisiana admitting privileges law that would have prevented doctors from providing abortion services unless they secured privileges at a hospital within 30 miles of where they provide abortion care. So this law was obviously also designed to close clinics and undermine abortion access, and was identical to the Texas law that the Supreme Court had struck down in 2016. So on June 29th, 2020, the court ruled Louisiana's abortion restriction unconstitutional as well. And the next battle is already here. That constitutional amendment I mentioned that passed in 2019 will be on the ballot this November. If passed, it would add language to the state's constitution that states, quote, "To protect human life, a right to abortion and the funding of abortion shall not be found in the Louisiana Constitution." There are a couple of things to note about this amendment that are important. One, it includes no exceptions, even in the case of rape, incest, and the many efforts to include those exceptions during the legislative session in 2019 were emphatically rejected by the legislature. Number two, Louisiana already has harsh restrictions on low-income women's access to abortion. Women who qualify for state assistance or Medicaid for health coverage are prohibited from using any funding for abortion except in very rare circumstances. Our next seminar on the 16th will cover in more depth the issue of funding for abortion and the impact it has on access. And we will be joined on that seminar by the New Orleans Abortion Fund for that discussion. So that actually concludes the seminar portion of this meeting. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And if you have them, you can type them into the chat box. If you can't access the access the chat box, you might be able to use the controls in the participant window to add a thumbs up, and I can try to unmute your line. Okay, we're getting a couple of questions in. Okay, we are getting a couple questions in.
I don't see them in chat, Michelle.
Oh, okay. I think they might be sent to me privately. So the first one is, who is funding the anti-abortion movement in Louisiana? That is a good question. I think that a lot of their funding comes from religious institutions, churches, but they also do receive a significant amount of funding, again, from the Choose Life license plates and other, conservative efforts. Lift Louisiana has actually done a bunch of research on crisis pregnancy centers, which are very closely in very close relationship with anti-abortion activists and lobbying groups like the Louisiana Right to Life. And those organizations are receiving funding from the state through the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is the welfare program. So it's hard to say exactly who is funding the anti-abortion movement, but I think that we all know that it is well funded and well organized. The next question is, are there, I was surprised to learn that the state once had 18 clinics. Are there any efforts directly underway to expand access? Yes, there are. Planned Parenthood's clinic in Louisiana has applied for a license to provide abortions. And the clinic, when it was built a couple years ago, built it to adhere to all of the abortion clinic, facility requirements. However, the license application that Planned Parenthood submitted to the state has been pending for upwards of 2 years. If there's anyone from Planned Parenthood on the phone that can tell me exactly how long, or if Ellie's on this call, who can tell me exactly how long that application has been pending. But so that's one case. And then there is also a clinic that has applied for an application in New Orleans East, and that application is also pending.
Michelle, I believe Roz Hinton had just sent a question.
Okay, that was the first one that I answered.
Okay.
Okay, so the next question is, does not found in the Constitution mean the same as banned in Louisiana? So essentially, yes. However, it is important to understand that that if this constitutional amendment is improved, it would not immediately ban abortions in Louisiana. It would lay the groundwork to do so. And it would also make it really difficult, if not impossible, for legislation that would provide any rights to abortion or expand access to abortion. It would make it much more difficult for those types of bills to be passed in Louisiana, because they could be challenged under this constitutional amendment.
We have a question that says, has there been pushback from pro-repo rights clergy members?
Oh, yes, there has been. There has been less of an organized effort than to support abortion access, as we, as the state saw in the years before the Roe decision. But there are definitely leaders in the faith community who are outspoken in their support for access to abortion.
And again, our strategy to defeat this constitutional amendment that would be on the ballot coming up in November?
That's a great question. We are, Lift Louisiana is working both with the Louisiana Coalition for Reproductive Freedom and the Louisiana for Personal Freedoms campaign on efforts to educate people about the constitutional amendment and to ensure that people understand the impact when they go to vote on November 3rd. So if you are interested in finding out more about the Louisiana for Personal Freedoms campaign, the campaign is organizing some trainings themselves that will go into a lot more detail about the strategy. And I'm going to put the email or the website for the campaign in the chat. so that you can sign up to get more information about those trainings.
Well, then that will answer the question about how do I personally get involved?
Yes, so there's a couple ways that you can get involved. Oh, excuse me for that sound. So I'm pausing the screen sharing for just a minute so that I can pull up the Louisiana for Personal Freedoms website. Yes, you can get involved by signing up for to get information about the campaign through this website. You can also, if you're not already signed up for Lift Louisiana's email list, and we are going to be doing some different types of activities for volunteers over the next few weeks that we have before this campaign ends on the November 3rd election. I will say, let's see, I also wanted to say that we did get an answer from someone from Planned Parenthood, so thank you, that the application has been pending since 2016. Okay, so we have another question. Does the constitutional amendment only require a simple majority, more than 50% vote, to be approved or enacted? Yes. And then one other question that I see here is, could there be regulation of crisis pregnancy centers to curb the dissemination of medically inaccurate information? Theoretically, yes, there could be. And we think that that would be a great thing. There are a crop of new legislators that came in this session in 2020 that were elected at the end of last year that are, more supportive of abortion access. And so, we're hoping that that there is going to be interest in some of these legislators in doing some things that may not necessarily go so far as, opening new clinics or repealing anti-abortion statutes that are on the books and in effect, but would be able to do some other types of things that could impact some of these sort of harmful effects. And certainly the crisis pregnancy centers are prolific in Louisiana, and they are the source of lots of misinformation because of the tactics that they use to sort of pose as abortion clinics in order to trick people into coming into the clinics thinking they're coming into an abortion clinic when they are they end up being somewhere that is really focused on talking them out of having an abortion and not providing them with all of their pregnancy options.
Okay, there's a question. How can I donate either my time or money to Lift Louisiana?
Well, that is a great question. So you can donate at our website. I'll actually put the link to donate in the chat. And then I'm going to go back to the screen share for just a second. Okay. So this is the link to donate to Lift Louisiana. We would absolutely love your support. And we would encourage you, if you want to make a long-term commitment to this fight in Louisiana, that you consider signing up to give a donation each month, which is a great way to give because it allows you to sort of spread your donation out over the course of the year, and enables you to, give more to the organization over time. And it's also a better way for us to be able to sort of, plan out what we're able to do, and have a lot more sort of certainty about the resources that we're going to have available to continue to represent people in Louisiana in the fight for abortion access. And you can also always sign up at our website or follow us on social media. So I'm going to go back to the presentation. If I can get there. It's hard for me to tell whether you can see the presentation or not. Okay. So this is how you can get in touch with us.
We have another.
Okay, great.
We have one more question, and it states, if the constitutional amendment passed, can it be challenged in federal court?
Oh, that is a good question. I don't think so. If Ellie's on the phone, she can hopefully type into the chat if I'm mistaken. I don't think that it would be able to be challenged in federal court. There's one more question that I'm seeing here. Is there any one or group that is helping write all of these anti-abortion laws? It seems like they're calculated for individual legislators. So that's a great question. There are a couple of organizations, anti-abortion organizations, that write model legislation. So that's why you see the same laws being passed in a bunch of different states, usually around the same time, like the admitting privileges law in Texas and the one in Louisiana were pretty much identical. And one of the organizations is called Americans United for Life. They publish a playbook and they hold conferences and they do a lot of outreach to anti-abortion legislators, and essentially, hand them the model legislation, and all they have to do is, fill in the word Louisiana in the legislation before they file it.
We have another question. What can I do to volunteer to help right now?
Well, that is a great question. So one of the things that we are, the Constitutional Amendment campaign is working on is signing people up to work basically in the field. And so a lot of that is going to be doing sort of virtual field work. So taking the tools and the resources and the messaging about the amendment and using it to have conversations with people in your community about the impact of the constitutional amendment. So if that is something that you are interested in doing, then I would really, really, really encourage you to sign up. And you're welcome to send us an email directly to the email address that's on the screen, and let us know that you're interested in stepping up to volunteer.
Another question. Volunteers are needed across the state, not just in New Orleans, correct?
Absolutely. And in fact, we really need volunteers in other parts of the state, and especially in communities like Shreveport, Bossier, Alexandria, and Lafayette, and Baton Rouge, and Monroe, and Ruston. those are places where, you know, there a lot of the legislators that are passing or introducing these anti-abortion laws are coming from areas in other parts of Louisiana and not necessarily New Orleans. So yes, if you are from, you know, Yankee country, you know, north of I-10, we absolutely need you to be part of this effort. And just to clarify, Ellie did respond that there unfortunately would not be the possibility of a federal court challenge to the amendment or any viable court challenge in state court either. So that is why it's so important for us to defeat it in November. So do we have any other questions?
I don't see any in the Zoom chat.
Okay. Well, that's great. So I guess that's going to wrap things up for us today. I'm going to launch the poll. And so please take a minute to answer these 2 very short questions. And please join us for the next seminar on Wednesday, September 16th at noon. And we will rebroadcast it again at 6 p.m. And again, we'll be posting the recordings of all of the seminars on our YouTube channel the following day. So we want to thank you so much for joining us today, for being involved and engaged in this work, for learning something, for asking questions, and for standing up for people in Louisiana who want reproductive freedom.